They thought they could just roll over me like loose gravel on a highway, that my family's history was nothing more than an inconvenient speed bump on their road to luxury living. But they made the classic mistake of confusing quiet patience with weakness. It started on a Tuesday, the kind of crisp, gold-lit Colorado morning that makes you thank God you're alive, at least until the peace was shattered by the grinding, mechanical scream of heavy diesel engines tearing through the silence. I remember standing on my porch, coffee mug half raised, watching in absolute disbelief as a convoy of yellow excavators and white pickup trucks smashed through my north fence line, treating the barbed wire I'd strung by hand like it was spiderweb. Leading the charge, stepping out of a pristine Range Rover with the kind of aggressive confidence that only comes from never having been told no in your entire life, was Brenda Sterling. Now, if you don't know Brenda, imagine a woman who weaponized her homeowners association badge like it was a sheriff's star, a woman who once tried to find me because the wind blew dust from my pasture onto her Lexus, and she was marching up my driveway with a stack of papers thick enough to choke a horse. She didn't even say hello, just tapped a manicured fingernail on the document, sneering, "Good morning, Elias. We're starting the excavation for the connector pipeline today. Your little cow pasture doesn't get to hold up progress for the 800 families of Sapphire Ridge Estates, so don't make this difficult. My name is Elias Thorne, and I inherited the Thorne Legacy Ranch from my grandpa Silas back in 2019, a slice of heaven that's been in our blood since before half these subdivisions were even a glimmer in a developer's eye. A place where the soil is rich and the history is deep. Grandpa Silas bought these 40 acres in 1952 with sweat equity and a handshake deal, leaving me a natural spring that's never run dry and enough grazing land for 50 head of cattle. But fast forward to today, and I'm surrounded by the encroaching sprawl of Sapphire Ridge Estates, a luxury development where the cheapest starter home costs more than I'll earn in a decade of ranching. The irony is thick enough to cut with a knife because these people moved out here for the rustic aesthetic, yet they call the cops if my cows moo too loudly during calving season or if my tractor disrupts their morning meditation. But Brenda, the HOA president from hell, and her husband Marcus Sterling, the CEO of Sterling Horizons Group, were a different breed of predator, the kind who smile while they eviscerate you. "You can't just dig up my land, Brenda," I told her, trying to keep the tremor of rage out of my voice as the excavators started trenching a 4-foot scar right through my prime winter grazing field. She just laughed, a hollow, metallic sound, and shoved the papers into my chest, saying, "It's a right of necessity easement, sweetie. We have the county permits, legal and signed. So maybe go tend to your animals and let the adults handle the infrastructure." She walked away, heels clicking on the pavement, leaving me standing there while her crew, led by a foreman named Luis who looked like he wanted to be anywhere else, started destroying 5 years of soil management in 5 minutes. I asked Luis to stop, and he just tipped his hard hat, looking apologetic, and said, "I just dig where the map tells me. Boss, take it up with the office," which is the universal code for, "I'm just a pawn in a game way above my pay grade." I called Old Man Miller, the only lawyer I could afford, a semi-retired estate attorney who operated out of a strip mall, and while he managed to file an emergency injunction, he gave me the bad news that in our county, construction can legally continue while disputes are being adjudicated, which basically meant they could destroy my land now and apologize later. That night, the air wasn't filled with the smell of sage and pine like usual, but with the acrid stench of diesel fumes and the dust of my broken earth, and I sat at the kitchen table feeling the walls closing in. My daughter, Lily, who is 16 going on 30 and sharper than a tack, looked up from her laptop with that intense focus she gets and said, "Dad, I've been reading about the water table for my civics project, and if they tap the main line through our property and drop the pressure, the spring might stop feeding the upper pasture," which was a punch to the gut I hadn't even considered. Without that spring, the Thorne Legacy Ranch is just dry dirt and tumbleweeds, and I'd have to sell the herd, and once the herd is gone, the land goes next. "We might lose it, honey," I admitted to her later, my voice cracking, and the look of fear in her eyes lit a fire in my belly that hadn't been there before, because this wasn't just about land anymore. It was about heritage. But Brenda and Marcus were just getting started. 2 days later, they launched a counteroffensive that would make a military strategist blush, filing formal complaints that my interference was endangering public health. and suddenly I was the villain in their narrative. Then came the expert, a man named Dr. Arthur Pendergast, who rolled up in a pristine white lab coat that had never seen a speck of dirt, claiming he was an independent environmental consultant hired to ensure compliance. The guy spent 4 hours taking photos of manure piles and mud puddles, actively ignoring the pristine spring water, framing every shot to make my ranch look like a toxic waste dump. "Just standard procedure, Mr. Thorne," he said with an oily smile that didn't reach his eyes. "We need to ensure your agricultural runoff isn't compromising the Sapphire Ridge water supply." And I knew right then, with a sinking feeling in my stomach, that the fix was in. Sure enough, 2 weeks later, the county health department slapped a cease and desist on my ranch operations based on Dr. Pendergast's preliminary report, claiming my cattle were a biohazard. I couldn't move my herd, I couldn't sell hay, I was paralyzed, bleeding money, and watching my livelihood disintegrate while the excavators kept churning up my land day after day. And just when I thought it couldn't get more transparent, Marcus Sterling's company, Sterling Horizons Group, submitted a benevolent offer to buy my distressed and contaminated property for about 40 cents on the dollar, framed as a favor to help me escape my legal troubles. I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling fan spinning uselessly, realizing that this wasn't an accident. It was a coordinated assassination of my life, a squeeze play designed to force me to sell the only thing my grandfather had left me. But they made one critical miscalculation, one fatal error in their arrogance. They assumed I was just a dumb cowboy who would roll over and die. I got up at 2 a.m., brewed a pot of coffee strong enough to wake the dead, and started digging through the county archives and HOA filings online, fueled by insomnia and a righteous anger that felt like magma in my chest. I discovered that Sapphire Ridge Estates was built on an old landfill from the 80s, which was interesting, but then I looked up Dr. Pendergast's credentials on the state board website and found out his license had expired 3 years ago. Even better, his independent consulting firm was a shell company registered to the same address as Sterling Horizons Group, meaning the man condemning my land was literally on Marcus's payroll. I felt the first spark of hope, a tiny ember in the ash, but I knew I needed more than just a gotcha moment to take down a beast this size. I reached out to an old contact, Buck, a neighbor who could fix a tractor engine with a paperclip and had a deep distrust of suits, and he helped me set up high-definition trail cameras along the pipeline route, documenting every trespass, every violation. Meanwhile, Lily, bless her heart, started posting videos on TikTok, documenting the destruction, the muddy water, the arrogance of Brenda, and slowly, the views started ticking up, not just hundreds, but thousands of people watching a real-time David and Goliath story. But the real turning point, the moment the universe decided to deal me a royal flush, happened when I was digging through a dusty, water-damaged box of Grandpa Silas's original deed papers in the attic. I was looking for boundary lines, anything to stop the excavators, when my hand brushed against a brittle, yellowed document titled Mineral and Subsurface Water Rights Conveyance, 1952. I unfolded it, squinting at the typewriter font, and as I read the legal description, my breath caught in my throat, and the room seemed to spin. It wasn't just the spring on my land. Grandpa Silas had purchased the rights to the entire aquifer source, the deep underground reservoir that fed the whole valley. I sat there, the paper trembling in my calloused hands, realizing that Marcus, Sterling, and Brenda weren't just stealing my land. They were building their entire empire on water that belonged to me. The realization hit me like a physical blow, followed immediately by a rush of adrenaline so potent I had to sit down before my knees gave out. Because in the American West, water isn't just a resource, it's a weapon, and I was holding the nuclear launch codes. I immediately called Elena Vance, a shark of an environmental lawyer from Denver who had reached out after seeing Lily's viral videos. And when I read her the deed number over the phone, there was a long, heavy silence followed by a low whistle. "Elias," she said, her voice dropping an octave. "If that document is authentic, you don't just have a case for trespassing. You have a claim for prior appropriation, which in Colorado water law means you are God, and they are the peasants praying for rain." We went into war mode immediately, transforming my kitchen table into a command center covered in maps, flow charts, and forensic accounting reports, while outside, the diesel engines of Sterling Horizons Group kept rumbling, unknowingly digging their own graves. Elena discovered that Marcus Sterling had been selling guaranteed perpetual water rights to the residents of Sapphire Ridge Estates as a premium feature to justify the million-dollar price tags. But here was the kicker. The county water table had dropped 40% in the last decade, and Marcus's usage permits were temporary. It gets worse, or better depending on where you're sitting, because we found out his permits were set to expire in exactly 18 months, at which point his company would owe over $4 million in utility bonds if he couldn't secure a permanent source. He was insolvent, leveraging the future to pay for the past, running a Ponzi scheme with water, and my ranch was the only thing standing between him and federal prison. While we were building the legal guillotine, Brenda decided to escalate the psychological warfare, hiring a private investigator, a greasy guy who looked like he slept in his car, to harass Lily's teachers and spread rumors at the local diner that I was an unfit father raising a child in squalor. It took every ounce of self-control I possessed not to drive over to her McMansion and confront her, but Elena grabbed my arm and said, "Don't you dare, Elias. Never interrupt your enemy when they are making a mistake. Let them overreach." And overreach they did. Marcus's crew, getting desperate to finish the pipeline before their financial house of cards collapsed, accidentally cut my main internet and phone lines twice in 1 week, isolating us, or so they thought. But Lily had already set us up with a satellite link, and she was digging into the public records of Marcus's other developments, finding a trail of unpaid contractors and liens that stretched back 5 years. "Dad," she told me one night, her face glowing blue from the screen, "he owes $2 million just to the concrete guys. He's broke. That's why they're rushing. They need the new home deposits to pay off the old loans." It was a classic desperate developer spiral, and I realized we didn't need to just stop the pipeline. We needed to take control of the asset. I asked Elena a question that made her spill her coffee. "What if we don't sue them? What if we buy them?" She looked at me like I'd grown a second head, but as I laid out the logic, her eyes started to sparkle. Marcus's water contracts were distressed assets, toxic debt that the local banks were terrified of holding, and since I owned the actual water source, I was the only person on earth who could actually fulfill the contracts. We approached the bank quietly, presenting Grandpa Silas's 1952 deed and the proof of Marcus's fraud, and the loan officers looked like they'd seen a ghost, realizing their entire portfolio in Sapphire Ridge was built on a lie. They were more than happy to bundle Marcus's debt and sell it to me for pennies on the dollar to clear their books, giving me legal ownership of the utility obligations for the entire subdivision. I took out a loan against the ranch, a massive risk that made my stomach churn, essentially betting the farm, my legacy, and Lily's future on one massive power play. If this failed, I was destitute, but if it worked, I would own the very infrastructure Marcus built to destroy me. Meanwhile, the harassment from Brenda turned frantic. She organized a safety meeting where she labeled me a domestic threat, claiming my tractors were weaponized vehicles, which would be hilarious if people didn't actually believe it. Chloe Reynolds, a journalist for the state paper who had been quietly following the story thanks to Lily's tips, started digging into the county commissioners who had approved the illegal permits, uncovering a nest of bribery and kickbacks that went all the way to the top. The tension on the ranch was palpable, a physical weight in the air, the silence of the night broken only by the hum of our generator and the watchful eyes of the trail cams. Then, the inevitable happened. They crossed the line from legal bullying to criminal violence. It was 3 a.m. on a Tuesday when my phone buzzed with a motion alert from the camera near the main water trough, the one specifically designated for the pregnant heifers. I pulled up the feed and watched in horror as 2 figures in Sterling Horizons uniforms jumped the fence, carrying unmarked plastic jerrycans, and started pouring a dark liquid into the water supply. I didn't yell, I didn't run out with my shotgun. I hit record, saving the footage to 3 different cloud servers, and called the sheriff, watching on the screen as they poisoned the water my animals drank. The deputies arrived 10 minutes later, catching the guys red-handed with the empty containers still in their truck, industrial solvent, enough to make the herd sick enough to justify a seizure, but not enough to kill them instantly. When the deputies checked the men's phones, they found text messages from a contact saved as Boss M saying, "Make it look like natural contamination. We need cause for emergency removal." That was the moment the game changed. This wasn't business anymore. They had tried to hurt innocent animals to get to me. I looked at the footage, then at the stack of bank documents transferring the water contracts to my name, and I knew it was time to end this. I told Elena and Lily, "Call the meeting. Let's finish them." The tension inside the Sapphire Ridge High School gymnasium was so thick you could almost taste the ozone, a mix of nervous sweat, expensive perfume, and the impending doom of a community on the brink of collapse. We had called the emergency town hall, bypassing the HOA entirely, and over 400 residents packed the bleachers, their faces a mask of confusion and fear because Chloe Reynolds had just published her exposé on the subdivision's water instability that morning. Brenda Sterling sat in the front row, arms crossed like a petulant child, flanked by Marcus, who looked like he had aged 10 years in a week, his suit hanging loosely on his frame as he tapped furiously on his phone. They expected a shouting match. They expected me to come in ranting about fences and cows, but they had no idea I was walking in with the keys to their kingdom. I walked to the microphone, the silence spreading outward from the center of the room until the only sound was the whir of the news cameras in the back. "My name is Elias Thorne," I began, keeping my voice low and steady, the voice of a man who spends his days talking to animals and his nights worrying about rain. "For months, you've been told I am the enemy. You've been told my ranch is a hazard, that I'm blocking progress, that I'm a threat to your property values." I paused, looking directly at Brenda, who sneered back, but her eyes darted nervously to the sheriff's deputies standing at the exits. "But the truth is," I continued, holding up the 1952 deed, "I don't just own the land next door. I own the water underneath your feet." A murmur rippled through the crowd, a sound like wind moving through dry corn. "Your developer," I pointed a calloused finger at Marcus, "sold you homes with water rights he didn't have. His permits expire in 6 months. After that, your taps run dry, your lawns die, and your homes become worthless." Brenda jumped up, screaming, "He's a liar. This is a stunt. Officer, remove him." But nobody moved, the air in the room frozen. "I'm not finished," I said, my voice hardening. "As of yesterday, the bank sold the defaulted water utility contracts for this entire subdivision to me. I bought Marcus's debt. I am now the legal provider of every drop of water that flows into Sapphire Ridge." The room erupted. It was absolute pandemonium. Marcus turned a ghostly shade of white, dropping his phone, while Brenda looked like she had been slapped. But I wasn't done. I signaled to Chloe, who projected the trail cam footage onto the massive screen behind me. The grainy, high-definition video of Sterling Horizon's employees poisoning my cattle troughs, followed by the text messages from Marcus. The gasps from the audience turned into angry shouts. The residents weren't looking at me anymore. They were looking at Marcus and Brenda with the kind of fury that topples empires. "This is criminal," Brenda shrieked, rushing the stage, but Deputy Miller stepped in her path, handcuffs already out. "Patricia Brenda Sterling, you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit environmental terrorism and harassment." At the same moment, 2 federal agents who had been waiting in the wings stepped toward Marcus, badges flashing. "Marcus Sterling, you're under arrest for wire fraud, bank fraud, and violation of the Clean Water Act." Watching them get marched out of that gymnasium, Brenda kicking and screaming about her rights while Marcus slumped in defeat, was a feeling I can't quite describe. It wasn't joy, exactly. It was the heavy, satisfied feeling of a fence post finally set straight and true. But I didn't leave the residents hanging. I turned back to the mic and quelled the panic. "I didn't buy the water to cut you off," I told the terrified families. "I'm forming a community water cooperative. You will own your own water, at cost, managed by the Thorne Legacy Ranch. No more corporate markups, no more lies. We're neighbors, and we're going to act like it." The standing ovation that followed wasn't for me. It was for the relief of people who realized they weren't going to lose their homes. In the 6 months since that night, life has changed in ways I never expected. Sapphire Ridge voted overwhelmingly to join the co-op. Marcus took a plea deal for 12 years in federal prison to avoid a longer sentence. And Brenda is facing a mountain of civil suits that will keep her in courtrooms for the rest of her natural life. Lily is now headed to college on a full scholarship for environmental law, funded by the profits from the co-op, and she's already planning to return to help protect other ranchers from predatory developers. The ranch is safe, the spring is flowing clear, and the pipeline route is being restored into a hiking trail connecting the subdivision to the open land. But as I sit here on the porch, watching the sun dip below the mountains, listening to the quiet lowing of the herd, I'm left with a question that keeps me up at night. I destroyed two people's lives to save my own. I used their greed as a trap and snapped the law shut on their necks. Was it justice? Absolutely. But when you hold that kind of power, when you have the ability to ruin your enemies completely, where do you draw the line? We won, and the bad guys lost. But in a world where money usually buys the verdict, I wonder, did I win because I was right? Or did I win because for once, I had the bigger stick? Let me know what you think in the comments. Is protecting your family worth becoming the monster they fear? This is Elias Thorne, signing off.